Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog of 1895 had descended upon London with the persistence of a guilty conscience, transforming the familiar thoroughfares of our great metropolis into a labyrinth of shadows and muffled sounds. Gas lamps flickered like dying stars through the yellow murk, while the clip-clop of hansom cabs echoed with ghostly resonance along the cobblestones of Baker Street. I had settled into my customary armchair beside our crackling fire, a medical journal open upon my lap, when the urgent rap of knuckles against our door shattered the evening's contemplative tranquillity. My friend Sherlock Holmes, who had been reclining upon the sofa in what appeared to be a state of profound meditation, though I suspected his keen mind was actually dissecting some intricate problem of criminal psychology, opened one grey eye with the languid interest of a cat disturbed from its afternoon repose. The familiar clatter of rapid footsteps ascending our 17 steps was followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried announcement and the measured tread of what could only be Inspector Lestrade's boots. "Holmes!" came the inspector's voice, breathless with exertion and something approaching genuine desperation. "Thank the Lord you are in. We need you at once. It is as pretty a knot as ever I brought you, and as ugly." Holmes, who had been standing with his back to the fire, his long hands clasped behind him in characteristic fashion, did not greet the inspector with his usual dry humour. His grey eyes had sharpened at the first sound of Lestrade's voice, and there was already that distant gleam of the chase in them, the predatory focus I had witnessed countless times before when presented with a puzzle worthy of his extraordinary abilities. "Pray be seated, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of courtesy and impatience that marked his professional demeanour. "You are wet to the knees, which tells me you have kept your poor cabman waiting longer than prudence would dictate. The urgency in your voice suggests a matter of considerable complexity. The case, if you please." Inspector Lestrade, a thin, ferret-like man whose sharp features had been weathered by years of police work, cast a nervous glance between Holmes and myself before settling into the offered chair. His usual composure had clearly been shaken by whatever scene awaited us in the fog-shrouded streets of London. "It is Sir Alister Penrith, Baronet, of Queen Anne Gate," Lestrade began, his voice carrying an undertone of professional bewilderment that I had rarely heard from the usually confident inspector. "Found dead in his private study this evening. The door was both locked and bolted from within, key turned tight in the inside lock, heavy bolt thrown home, and a chain secured across the jamb. Windows latched from the interior, shutters barred, the chimney too narrow for a sweep's boy, and no other means of egress. Yet there he sits, as dead as Julius Caesar, with no weapon to be found and no explanation for how his killer might have escaped." Holmes reached for his pipe, a gesture that in my long experience indicated either supreme skepticism or intense fascination. "A locked room mystery," he murmured, his fingers working the tobacco with practised precision. "They are somewhat out of fashion, Lestrade, though London has not afforded me one worthy of the name in some considerable time. Pray continue with the particulars." The inspector cleared his throat, consulting his notebook with the methodical precision that marked his approach to police work. "Sir Alister's valet, one Rook, attempted to deliver his master's customary evening brandy at 9:30. Finding no response to his knocking, he summoned the butler, Hargreaves. Together they hammered upon the door, calling out, and eventually roused the entire household. The housekeeper, Mrs. Oakes, confirmed that Sir Alister was known to work late into the night on his business correspondence. He maintains extensive interests in steelworks at Deptford." "And the method of entry?" Holmes inquired, striking a match with that characteristic flick of his wrist. We were forced to break down the door, Mr. Holmes. The locksmith confirmed that the mechanism had been secured from within. The key was discovered some 2 feet inside the room, lying upon the carpet as if it had been flung there. The bolt, as I mentioned, was thrown from the interior, and there is no mechanism by which it might be operated from the corridor. I set aside my medical journal, my professional interest, thoroughly aroused by the inspector's account. "What was the apparent cause of death?" I inquired, drawing upon my years of medical practice. Lestrade's expression grew even more troubled. "That is perhaps the most perplexing aspect of the entire affair, Dr. Watson. Sir Alistair was found seated at his desk, slumped forward as if he had simply fallen asleep over his papers. There was no visible wound, no signs of violence, no indication of a struggle. Yet the local physician detected a faint odour of bitter almonds about the body, and the man's face bore the unmistakable signs of acute distress, features contorted, fingers clenched. Cyanide poisoning by all appearances." Holmes paused in the lighting of his pipe, his keen eyes fixed upon the inspector with renewed interest. "Cyanide, you say? Most singular. And what of the room itself? Any disturbance? Signs of search or robbery?" "None whatsoever. Sir Alistair's watch and rings remained upon his person, his safe was undisturbed, and his papers lay scattered about the desk in what appeared to be the natural disorder of a man interrupted in his work. There was, however, one curious detail." Lestrade hesitated, as if uncertain whether to mention what might prove to be an irrelevant observation. "In my experience, Inspector," Holmes said dryly, "it is precisely those details which others dismiss as curious that prove most illuminating. Pray, continue." "There was a peculiar smell in the room. Not the bitter almonds of the poison, but something else entirely. Sharp, resinous, rather like the substance one might find upon a violin bow. And there was a small smear of some gummy material upon the brass of the door key, barely visible but unmistakably present." The transformation in Holmes's demeanour was immediate and striking. The languid air of the evening was swept aside in an instant, replaced by that keen, predatory alertness that marked the beginning of one of his intellectual campaigns. He rose from his chair with fluid grace, moving to the window where he gazed out into the fog-shrouded street below. "Rosin, Lestrade," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that I recognized as the first stirring of understanding. "Not oil, but rosin, and the key, you are certain of its position upon the carpet?" "As certain as I am of my own name, Mr. Holmes. 2 feet within the room, lying at an angle that suggested it had been thrown with some force." Holmes turned back to us, and I saw in his face that peculiar mixture of excitement and calculation that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "Watson, your coat and medical bag, if you please. Inspector, have your cabman wait. We shall accompany you to Queen Anne Gate immediately. If there is truth to be found in this business, it will be written in the smallest details, and the fog may serve to preserve what careless feet might otherwise destroy." As I gathered my things, I observed that familiar tightening in my chest that was neither fear nor excitement, but some curious mixture of both. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot, and I would not have missed the unfolding of this mystery for a king's ransom. Already I could sense the intricate machinery of my friend's remarkable mind beginning to work upon the problem, sorting and cataloguing each detail with the precision of a master craftsman. The hansom that awaited us outside bore the unmistakable signs of a hurried journey through London's fog-bound streets, its lamps glowing like amber eyes in the murk, the horse stamping impatiently upon the wet cobblestones. As we settled into our seats, Holmes leaned forward with that intensity of purpose that marked the beginning of every significant case. "Tell me, Lestrade," he said as our cab lurched into motion, What manner of man was Sir Alister Penrith? His habits, his associates, his particular interests or eccentricities? The inspector consulted his notes once more. A man of regular habits and considerable wealth, derived primarily from his interests in heavy industry. Widower these 5 years past, no surviving children. Known as a patron of mechanical curiosities and foreign devices, his study, I'm told, contains quite a collection of ingenious locks, clockwork mechanisms, and similar contrivances. His business partner, one Mr. Peregrine Blount, describes him as methodical, to a fault, though perhaps somewhat suspicious of others' motives. And his household, servants, regular visitors? The usual complement: butler, housekeeper, valet, kitchen staff. His secretary, Miss Ada Vale, maintains rooms in Bloomsbury and attends daily to his correspondence. His nephew, Mr. Edwin Penrith, visited yesterday afternoon, but departed well before the evening. No one else was known to be in the house at the time of death. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture I knew so well. A locked room, a missing weapon, the scent of rosin, and a key thrown with apparent violence. The elements of our puzzle begin to take shape, Watson, though their ultimate configuration remains tantalizingly obscure. As our hansom turned into the quieter dignity of Queen Anne Gate, I noted the gas lamps still flickering through the fog and the wet cobblestones that reflected our passage like a dark mirror. We drew up before a tall house of that plain, substantial style which speaks of old money and conservative tastes, precisely the sort of residence one might expect of a successful industrialist with baronial pretensions. Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen eyes sweeping over the doorway with that quick, comprehensive glance that missed nothing of significance. I observed him note a faint, brownish smear upon the polished brass letter slot, and upon the mat just within the smallest curl of cork that might have fallen from a wine bottle. Whether these details held any significance in the greater puzzle, I could not say, but I had learned long ago that nothing escaped my friend's attention without reason. "The study, if you please," Holmes said to the grave-faced butler who admitted us, and Hargreaves led us along a panelled corridor where a rack of umbrellas stood, sentinel, one place conspicuously empty, water still pooled upon the tray beneath. When the library door opened at the butler's touch, we were met by that peculiar silence which attends a death within walls, the hush of leather-bound volumes and thick carpets, broken only by the faint hiss of gas from the corridor beyond. The room itself was a testament to its owner's scholarly inclinations and mechanical interests. Tall bookcases lined the walls, interspersed with glass cabinets containing an array of curious devices, clockwork automata, intricate locks, precision instruments whose purposes I could only guess at. Sir Alister Penrith sat slumped in his high-backed chair of green leather, his face turned slightly, as if listening for some distant sound, his features bearing the unmistakable stamp of his final agony. Upon his desk lay scattered papers, an overturned brandy glass, and the dark stain where its contents had spilled across the blotter. The air held that sharp, resinous scent Lestrade had described, mingled with the leather and parchment smell of old books. Holmes stood very still for a long moment, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene with that methodical precision that marked his approach to every case. When he finally moved, it was with the careful economy of motion I had observed countless times before, each step measured, each glance purposeful, every gesture calculated to disturb as little as possible while revealing as much as could be learned. "Watson," he said at last, his voice carrying a note of quiet satisfaction, "pray observe the position of the key, the curious mark upon the door bolt, and the arrangement of papers upon the desk. Note particularly the thread of silk caught upon the window latch, the faint residue upon the fireplace grate, and, if your medical training serves you well, the precise angle at which our unfortunate baronet has met his end. He moved to examine the door more closely, his magnifying glass appearing as if by magic in his hand. "Most instructive," he murmured, his attention focused upon some minute detail invisible to my less practiced eye. "The question, my dear Lestrade, is not how the murderer entered this room. That much is perfectly clear to anyone with eyes to see. The true mystery lies in understanding how he managed to lock the door from the inside out." "From the inside out?" Lestrade repeated, his voice heavy with confusion. But Holmes merely smiled that thin, private smile, which, to those who knew him well, was the surest sign that the hunt had begun in earnest. I moved at once to examine the body with the clinical detachment my medical training demanded, though the sight of Sir Alistair Penrith's final agony stirred familiar unease within my chest. The baronet had been a well-fed man of perhaps 60 years, his silver hair carefully arranged despite the violence of his last moments. His fingers were clenched, as Lestrade had described, and beneath the waxy pallor of death I could discern that characteristic cherry-red complexion which my years of practice had taught me to associate with prussic acid poisoning. "The symptoms are entirely consistent with cyanide," I confirmed, noting how the bitter almond scent clung faintly to the corpse. "Death would have been swift but agonizing. The poison was almost certainly administered in liquid form, judging by the overturned brandy glass." I examined the rigidity of the limbs and the temperature of the skin. "I would estimate death occurred between 2 and 3 hours ago, which aligns precisely with the valet's attempt to deliver the evening brandy." Holmes nodded absently, his attention already focused upon the brass key that lay upon the Persian carpet. He knelt beside it with that feline grace I had witnessed countless times, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. "Most instructive, Watson. Observe the resinous material upon the key's surface, not merely rosin but beeswax as well, applied deliberately to the teeth." He carefully transferred a minute sample to his evidence envelope. "A well-waxed key turns in absolute silence, most useful when one wishes to avoid detection." Moving to the door itself, Holmes examined the heavy bolt with meticulous attention. "See here, Lestrade, this faint abrasion upon the bolt's face, and these almost invisible silk fibres caught in the chain staple." He extracted the crimson threads with his forceps, handling them as delicately as a surgeon might lift a nerve. Finest quality silk, not the sort of material one would expect in a gentleman's study unless placed there with deliberate purpose. The window drew his attention next, its latches secure from within and shutters properly barred. Yet something had caught his interest, for he spent considerable time examining the frame itself. Another silk thread, Watson, caught precisely where the sash meets the frame, and here, upon the inner latch, traces of that same waxy substance we found upon the key. From the window, Holmes moved to examine the collection of mechanical curiosities that adorned a nearby cabinet. These intricate devices, testament to Victorian engineering ingenuity, seemed to fascinate him considerably. "Swiss craftsmanship," he murmured, studying a complex clockwork automaton through the glass. "Observe how the dust has been disturbed around this particular mechanism, and there, upon the glass, the faint impression of fingers recently pressed against the surface." The fireplace yielded further mysteries. Holmes knelt before the cold grate, stirring the ashes with a poker to reveal fragments of what appeared to be recently burned correspondence. "Our killer was thorough, but not quite thorough enough," he observed, extracting a partially consumed corner of what might once have been a photograph. The fire was set hastily without proper attention, to complete destruction. Inspector Lestrade, growing increasingly restless, summoned the butler Hargreaves for questioning. The grave-faced servant confirmed that Sir Alistair had dined alone at 7, and at 8:15 a messenger boy had delivered a small parcel from the Deptford Steelworks. His master made some jest about a toy to keep an old man's fingers honest, Hargreaves reported, his composure barely concealing his distress. "And visitors?" Holmes inquired with deceptive casualness. "Mr. Edwin Penrith, the master's nephew, called yesterday afternoon but departed well before 5. Miss Ada Vale, his secretary, maintains her usual schedule but was not present this evening. No other callers were admitted." The valet Rook, when pressed, admitted to hearing a curious sound some time after 8, a whirring, like a spring running down, which he had attributed to one of Sir Alistair's mechanical contrivances. This detail seemed to particularly interest Holmes, who exchanged a meaningful glance with me before continuing his examination. "Tell me, Hargreaves," Holmes said, his voice carrying that tone of suppressed excitement I knew so well. "Was Sir Alistair in the habit of securing his study door when working?" "Always, sir. He was most particular about his privacy and possessed a keen interest in locks and mechanisms. Often tinkered with them himself, he did." Holmes straightened, his grey eyes holding that distant gleam which invariably preceded his most startling revelations. "A tinkerer, you say? Most illuminating indeed." He moved once more to the curious automaton, his fingers tracing its brass housing with evident appreciation. "The solution to our locked room mystery, Watson, lies not in impossibility, but in the ingenious application of mechanical principles. Our killer possessed not only intimate knowledge of the deceased's habits, but considerable understanding of precision engineering. The fog beyond the windows had thickened during our investigation, transforming familiar London into a maze of shadows and muffled sounds. Somewhere in that yellow murk, a clever murderer moved freely, confident in his ingenious method. But observing the growing satisfaction in Holmes's expression, I knew that confidence would prove tragically misplaced. Holmes did not immediately respond to my unspoken question, but instead returned his attention to the brass automaton with renewed intensity. His magnifying glass revealed what my untrained eye had missed: fresh fingerprints upon the crystal panels, overlaying the accumulated patina of years, and beneath the mechanism's base, parallel scratches in the marble surface suggesting the heavy device had been recently moved. "Most illuminating, Watson," he murmured, producing his penknife to extract a minute fibre from the automaton's winding mechanism. "Observe how this silk thread has been wound about the gear assembly, then snapped under tension. The mainspring shows signs of recent operation, yet the household staff assure us that only Sir Alistair was permitted to handle his collection." He carefully examined the device's housing, noting traces of the same waxy substance we had discovered upon the door key. "Someone has operated this mechanism within the past day, and with considerable knowledge of its internal workings." The significance of this discovery was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor beyond. Heavy, measured footsteps approached, accompanied by the authoritative voice of a man clearly accustomed to command. Inspector Lestrade moved to intercept the newcomer, but a tall gentleman of military bearing had already entered the study, his keen eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. "Colonel Reginald Ashford," the man announced, removing his hat with practiced precision. "Sir Alistair's solicitor and executor. I came immediately upon receiving word of this shocking business." His gaze lingered upon the corpse with the detached manner of one who had witnessed death upon distant battlefields before settling upon Holmes with evident recognition. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume?" "Your reputation precedes you, sir." Holmes acknowledged the introduction. With a slight nod, though his attention remained focused upon the mechanical collection. "Colonel Ashford, your arrival is most fortuitous. You were intimately acquainted with Sir Alister's habits and interests. Can you enlighten us regarding this particular automaton?" The Colonel approached the cabinet with evident familiarity, his practised eye noting immediately that something was amiss. The Swiss dancing master, acquired from a clockmaker in Geneva some 3 years past. When wound, the figure performs an elaborate sequence while a hidden music box plays. Sir Alister was particularly proud of its precision timing mechanism. He frowned, studying the device's position. "Though I must observe it has been moved from its customary place. Sir Alister was most particular about the arrangement of his treasures." "And who else possessed knowledge of these mechanical curiosities?" Holmes inquired, his fingers tracing the silk threads with delicate precision. "Very few, I should think. His nephew Edwin showed interest, though more in their monetary value than their craftsmanship. Miss Vale, his secretary, was granted access when cataloguing his effects for insurance purposes. Beyond that, only Mr. Peregrine Blount, his business partner, who shared Sir Alister's fascination with precision engineering." Inspector Lestrade, growing increasingly restless, cleared his throat meaningfully. "Mr. Holmes, while these mechanical curiosities are doubtless fascinating, we have a murder to solve. Surely our time would be better spent questioning the household more thoroughly?" Holmes turned from the cabinet with that thin smile I recognized as indicating either supreme confidence or barely controlled impatience. "My dear Lestrade, I fear you mistake the forest for the trees. The solution to Sir Alister's murder lies not in distant enemies, but in the precise application of mechanical principles by someone with intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and his collection." He moved to examine the door frame more closely, his lens revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. "Consider the curious acoustics Rook described, that whirring sound like a spring running down. Consider the silk threads we have discovered, the strategic placement of wax upon both key and latch, and the deliberate positioning of this automaton." His fingers traced what appeared to be a minute aperture in the ornate carving of the doorframe, barely visible to the naked eye. The method employed was both ingenious and diabolical, requiring considerable mechanical knowledge. Colonel Ashford observed this analysis with growing fascination. "You suspect some form of remote manipulation?" "I am beginning to form a theory," Holmes replied carefully, examining the partially burned correspondence in the grate. Among the charred fragments, he extracted a corner of what appeared to be a photograph, badly damaged but still showing the outline of a young woman's face. "Our killer was thorough, but not quite thorough enough. This photograph, Colonel. Does the subject appear familiar?" The solicitor studied the fragment with evident discomfort. "I cannot be certain, given the damage, but it may be Miss Catherine Morehouse, a young woman who was associated with Sir Alister some years past. There was considerable scandal at the time." "Indeed? And what became of Miss Morehouse?" "She disappeared rather suddenly shortly after Sir Alister's wife learned of the liaison. There were rumours of a settlement, though Sir Alister never spoke of the matter." Holmes carefully preserved the photograph fragment, his expression suggesting another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. "Tell me, Colonel, was Sir Alister in the habit of altering his will?" He had recently expressed concerns about certain beneficiaries and wished to establish more stringent conditions for inheritance. The matter was to be finalized within the fortnight. The Colonel's voice carried a note of professional discretion. "His nephew Edwin stands to inherit the bulk of the estate under the current will, including the house and business interests." And was young Mr. Penrith aware of these proposed changes? Sir Alistair intended to discuss the matter with him, though I cannot say with certainty whether he had done so. The fog beyond the windows had grown so dense that the street lamps were barely visible, their light diffused into ghostly halos that seemed to float in the yellow murk. Holmes returned once more to the automaton, his attention focused upon some detail that continued to elude my understanding. "Watson," he said at length, "I believe we have sufficient evidence to begin reconstructing the sequence of events. The method employed was both ingenious and methodical, requiring not only mechanical expertise but intimate knowledge of Sir Alistair's habits and possessions." He straightened, his grey eyes holding that distant gleam which invariably preceded his most startling revelations. "The game, as they say, is afoot, though I suspect our quarry believes himself safely beyond the reach of justice." The implications of Holmes's words sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the November fog pressing against the windows. Somewhere in that yellow murk, a clever murderer moved freely, confident in an ingenious method that had transformed an impossible crime into what appeared to be a perfect murder. Yet observing the growing satisfaction in my friend's expression, I knew that confidence would prove tragically misplaced. The arrival of Miss Ada Vale at precisely that moment provided our investigation with its most significant development thus far. Sir Alistair's secretary appeared in the doorway with the quiet efficiency that marked her professional bearing, though her composed features could not entirely conceal the shock of witnessing her employer's tragic end. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years, dressed in the practical attire of the modern working woman, her dark hair arranged with severe precision beneath a modest hat, still damp from the evening fog. "Inspector Lestrade," she said, her voice carrying the educated accent of the middle classes, "I came immediately upon hearing the terrible news. How may I assist your investigation?" Holmes observed her entrance with that peculiar intensity he reserved for potentially crucial witnesses. "Miss Vale, your intimate knowledge of Sir Alistair's affairs may prove invaluable. When did you last see your employer alive?" "Yesterday afternoon, Mr. Holmes. I departed at my usual hour of 4 o'clock, leaving Sir Alistair in excellent spirits. He had received confirmation of a particularly profitable Admiralty contract." Her gaze fell upon the overturned brandy glass with evident distress. "He was most particular about his evening ritual, a single measure of cognac while reviewing correspondence." Holmes moved to examine the glass more closely, producing his magnifying lens to study the rim with meticulous attention. "Most illuminating, Watson. Observe this faint residue beneath the lip, not merely the poison itself, but traces of beeswax mixed with the crystals." He carefully scraped a minute sample with his penknife. The cyanide was applied to the glass beforehand, held in place by a ring of softened wax. When the brandy was poured, the liquid dissolved both poison and adhesive. "But the decanter itself?" I inquired, noting its position upon the sideboard. "Clean, as I suspected. Our killer knew Sir Alistair's habits precisely, that he poured his own drink, that he would use this particular glass, that he would be alone at the appointed hour." Holmes returned his attention to Miss Vale. "You mentioned his excellent spirits. Had there been any recent concerns or anxieties?" Miss Vale hesitated, her professional discretion warring with obvious necessity. Sir Alistair had grown increasingly suspicious of certain business associates. He spoke of irregularities in the Deptford accounts, discrepancies he attributed to deliberate manipulation. He had requested a complete audit of all partnerships. Colonel Ashford shifted uncomfortably. "Surely you do not suggest financial impropriety on Mr. Blount's part?" "I report only what Sir Alistair confided to me, she replied with measured precision. However, I can confirm he had been corresponding with independent accountants regarding a thorough examination of the books. Holmes examined the scattered papers upon the desk with renewed interest. Among the correspondence, his keen eye detected a telegram bearing yesterday's date. "Miss Vale, can you identify this communication?" She studied the brief message with evident puzzlement. "Package dispatched as requested. Timing mechanism tested and verified. Z." Her frown deepened. "I have no record of Sir Alistair requesting any package, and this signature is unfamiliar." "Perhaps not so unfamiliar as you might think," Holmes murmured, carefully preserving the telegram. "Tell me, who among Sir Alistair's recent visitors possessed detailed knowledge of his mechanical collection?" His nephew Edwin showed considerable interest, though more in their monetary value than craftsmanship. Mr. Blount certainly, given his engineering background, and there was a Swiss gentleman last month, a clockmaker named Zimmermann, who performed maintenance on several pieces. Miss Vale paused thoughtfully. "He spent considerable time examining the automaton, making detailed sketches of its internal components." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me, his grey eyes holding that familiar gleam of understanding. "This Herr Zimmermann, describe his visit in detail." "He claimed to be impressed by the precision of the timing mechanism, which he said was accurate to the second. Sir Alistair was quite flattered and allowed him unrestricted access." Her voice carried a note of retrospective unease, though his interest seemed somewhat excessive for a simple maintenance visit. The implications settled upon our group like the fog pressing against the windows. Holmes returned to the automaton, his attention focused upon the brass cylinder within its housing. The whirring sound Rook described, the silk threads we discovered, the strategic application of wax, all components of an elaborate mechanism designed to create the perfect locked room mystery. He straightened, his expression carrying that austere satisfaction which marked significant progress. "The method grows clearer, though the identity of our mechanically gifted murderer remains tantalizingly obscured. We must examine more closely those who possessed both motive and the requisite knowledge to execute so ingenious a crime." Somewhere in the fog-shrouded streets beyond, a clever killer moved confidently, believing his impossible crime unsolvable. Yet, observing Holmes's growing certainty, I knew that confidence would soon prove fatally misplaced. The sound of urgent footsteps in the corridor beyond interrupted Holmes's contemplation of the mechanical evidence before us. Hargreaves appeared once more in the doorway, his professional composure strained by the evening's extraordinary events, announcing the arrival of Mr. Edwin Penrith, who had come immediately upon receiving word of his uncle's tragic death. The young man who entered bore the unmistakable stamp of his breeding, though his usual composure had clearly been shattered by the news. Edwin Penrith was perhaps 28 years of age, fashionably dressed despite the lateness of the hour, his dark hair dishevelled as if he had run his fingers through it repeatedly. His eyes, darting nervously about the study, fixed upon the corpse with a mixture of genuine grief and something approaching panic. "Uncle Alistair," he breathed, his voice carrying authentic distress. "Dear God, what monster could have done such a thing?" His gaze swept across the scattered papers with obvious urgency, and I observed his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to maintain his composure. Holmes had been examining the wastebasket beside the desk during this entrance, and from that unpromising receptacle he extracted several items of interest. A tight curl of brown paper bearing the printed stamp of the Deptford Iron and Precision Works, a coil of string darkened by oil, and most significantly a narrow sliver of brass with a drilled eye and faint toothed scoring along one face. He balanced this last upon his finger with the delicacy of a surgeon before slipping it into an evidence envelope. "Mr. Penrith," Holmes said, observing the young man with that peculiar intensity he reserved for potentially crucial witnesses, "your concern is understandable, though I note your attention seems drawn to your uncle's correspondence rather than his person. Pray tell us, when did you last see Sir Alistair alive?" Edwin's nervous energy seemed to intensify under Holmes's steady gaze. "Yesterday afternoon, Mr. Holmes. I departed at my usual hour, shortly after 4 o'clock. Uncle Alistair was in excellent spirits, though he had been somewhat preoccupied with business matters of late." His voice carried a defensive note. "We discussed certain family arrangements, nothing more." "Indeed? And these family arrangements, did they concern your uncle's will?" The colour drained from Edwin's face at this direct question. Uncle Alistair had mentioned certain modifications he was considering, restrictions he felt might be prudent given modern circumstances. I confess, I found his concerns somewhat excessive. Holmes moved to examine Edwin's hands more closely, his magnifying glass revealing details that confirmed his earlier observations. "Most illuminating, Mr. Penrith. Your fingernails show traces of brass polish, and your coat bears evidence of recent contact with machine oil. Most curious for a gentleman of leisure." Edwin's composure cracked visibly at this observation. "I have been examining some of Uncle Alistair's mechanical curiosities," he admitted with obvious discomfort. He had promised to explain the workings of several particularly intricate pieces, including that Swiss automaton you have been studying so intently. "And did this mechanical education prove instructive?" "Uncle Alistair was most generous with his knowledge. He showed me the internal mechanisms, explained the precision required for proper timing, even demonstrated the adjustment procedures." Edwin's voice carried a note of genuine admiration, mixed with obvious anxiety, though I confess the complexity was quite beyond my amateur understanding. Miss Vale, who had been observing this exchange with growing concern, stepped forward with professional discretion. "Mr. Holmes, I should mention that Sir Alistair had recently expressed certain doubts about family members and their motivations regarding his estate. He had been considering substantial changes to his will. The implications of this revelation settled upon our group with uncomfortable weight." Holmes returned to the automaton, his attention focused upon a particular mechanism within its brass housing. "The timing device you mentioned, Mr. Penrith, did your uncle explain its precision capabilities?" "He was quite proud of its accuracy, claimed it could be calibrated to the very second. Said the Swiss clockmaker who maintained it, Zimmermann, I believe, had been most impressed with its reliability." Edwin paused, his nervous energy betraying deeper anxiety. "Though I cannot see what relevance such mechanical details hold for this terrible crime." Holmes straightened, his expression carrying that austere satisfaction which marked significant progress in his understanding. "On the contrary, Mr. Penrith, I suspect these mechanical details hold the very key to your uncle's murder. The method employed was both ingenious and diabolical, requiring not only intimate knowledge of Sir Alistair's habits, but considerable expertise in precision engineering." Before Edwin could respond to this ominous pronouncement, the sound of wheels upon cobblestones echoed from the street beyond, followed by the urgent clanging of a bell. Hargreaves reappeared to announce that Mr. Peregrine Blount had arrived in answer to the telegram, his face bearing that expression of professional gravity which, in my experience, often preceded the most significant revelations. Holmes's face settled into that expression of courteous impassivity, which, to those who knew him well, portended the most searching of interviews. The game was indeed afoot, and I sensed we were approaching the crucial moment when all the carefully gathered threads of evidence would begin to weave themselves into the pattern of truth. Mr. Peregrine Blount entered the study with the measured stride of a man accustomed to command, though the gravity of the evening's events had clearly shaken his customary composure. He was a gentleman of robust build and middle years, his practical dress and work-hardened hands speaking of one who had risen through industry rather than inheritance. His keen eyes, sharp with intelligence that had served him well in business, swept the room with professional assessment before settling upon his deceased partner with unmistakable shock. "Good God, Alistair!" he breathed, removing his hat with practised precision. "I came immediately upon receiving the telegram. What devil's work is this?" His gaze moved from the corpse to Holmes with obvious recognition. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume? Your reputation in criminal matters precedes you, though I never imagined we should meet under such tragic circumstances." Holmes acknowledged the introduction with a slight nod, though his attention remained focused upon the mechanical evidence scattered throughout the study. "Mr. Blount, your intimate knowledge of Sir Alister's business affairs may prove invaluable. When did you last communicate with your partner?" "Yesterday morning, by telegram. We had been discussing certain financial discrepancies that required immediate attention." Blount's voice carried the measured precision of a man accustomed to choosing his words carefully in matters of business. "Alistair had grown increasingly concerned about irregularities in our accounts, though I had hoped to resolve the matter quietly." Miss Vale stepped forward with professional efficiency, producing a leather portfolio from her satchel. "I have brought Sir Alister's recent correspondence, Mr. Holmes, including his communications with the independent auditors he had engaged." She extracted several documents with practised precision. The discrepancies, Mr. Blount mentions, total nearly £15,000 attributed to unauthorised withdrawals from our Admiralty contract accounts. The effect of this revelation upon Edwin Penrith was immediate and striking, his nervous energy intensifying visibly. Blount's expression grew troubled, though he maintained his composure under Holmes's watchful gaze. £15,000 represents a substantial portion of our operating capital," Blount admitted reluctantly. "I had assumed the matter involved clerical errors or minor bookkeeping discrepancies. Alistair had not shared the precise extent of his concerns." Holmes examined the brass sliver he had extracted from the waste-basket with renewed interest. "Tell me, Mr. Blount, your background includes considerable experience with precision engineering, does it not?" "I trained as a mechanical engineer before entering the steel business. Alistair often consulted me regarding his collection of mechanical curiosities, particularly when repairs or adjustments were required." Blount's voice carried a defensive note, though I fail to see what relevance my technical knowledge bears upon this tragic affair. Holmes moved to examine the automaton once more, his magnifying glass revealing details that continued to elude ordinary observation. "On the contrary, Mr. Blount, I suspect your mechanical expertise may prove central to understanding how this apparently impossible crime was accomplished." He straightened, his grey eyes holding that familiar gleam of approaching revelation. "The method employed required not only intimate knowledge of Sir Alister's habits, but considerable skill in precision timing mechanisms." Before Blount could respond, Holmes had turned his attention to the fireplace, where among the charred fragments his practised eye detected something that caused him to pause with evident satisfaction. He extracted a corner of what appeared to be a photograph, badly damaged but still showing the outline of a young woman's face. "Mr. Blount," Holmes said, holding out the fragment, "does this young woman appear familiar to you?" Blount took the remnant, and I observed his face grow ashen as recognition dawned. "Catherine Morehouse," he whispered, his earlier bluster entirely abandoned. "Good heavens, I haven't seen her since the scandal years ago. She was Alistair's mistress, a beautiful but tragic creature. And what became of Miss Morehouse? She disappeared rather suddenly after Alistair's wife learned of the liaison. There were rumours of a substantial settlement, though Alistair never spoke of the matter afterward. Blount's voice carried genuine discomfort. But what could a ghost from the past have to do with this present tragedy? Holmes carefully preserved the photograph fragment, his expression suggesting another crucial piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Sometimes, Mr. Blount, the past has a most inconvenient way of intruding upon the present, and sometimes the most intricate mechanisms are set in motion by the simplest of human passions. He produced a thin wire probe from his pocket, moving to examine the door mechanism with surgical precision. Observe, Watson, how this minute aperture in the ornate carving connects directly with the bolt mechanism through the door's hollow core. He inserted the probe carefully, demonstrating the hidden channel. A silk thread passed through this opening could manipulate the bolt from the corridor, provided one possessed the proper mechanical advantage and timing. The implications of this demonstration settled upon our group with uncomfortable weight. Holmes continued his examination, revealing traces of wax and silk that confirmed his theory of the locked room's manipulation. "The solution grows clearer with each revelation," he said, his voice carrying that note of quiet satisfaction which invariably preceded his most startling deductions. Our killer possessed not only mechanical expertise, but access to specialized equipment and detailed knowledge of Sir Alistair's evening routine. The fog beyond the windows had grown so dense that the street lamps were barely visible, their light diffused into ghostly halos floating in the yellow murk. Holmes returned to his methodical examination, each detail adding another thread to the web of evidence he was weaving. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes said at length, "I believe we have gathered sufficient evidence from this room. There are certain inquiries I must make, certain connections I must verify, before the complete pattern of this ingenious crime can be laid bare." His gaze swept across our assembled group with that penetrating intensity I knew so well. "The game, as they say, is afoot, though I suspect our quarry believes himself safely beyond the reach of justice." Somewhere in the fog-shrouded streets beyond, a clever murderer moved confidently, believing his impossible crime had created the perfect deception. Yet observing Holmes's growing certainty and the mounting weight of evidence, I knew that confidence would soon prove fatally misplaced. Holmes sealed the study with characteristic efficiency, instructing Lestrade to maintain strict surveillance over all household members before we plunged once more into the fog-shrouded streets of Westminster. The November mist had thickened during our investigation, transforming familiar thoroughfares into a labyrinth of shadows and muffled sounds that seemed to swallow our hansom cab within moments of departure. The telegram bearing the signature ZID represents our most promising lead, Holmes announced, settling back against the worn leather seats with that restless energy I recognized as marking significant progress. Watson, observe how our killer's mechanical expertise extends beyond mere clockwork to encompass the precise coordination of multiple elements across time and distance. Our first destination proved to be the telegraph office nearest to Queen Anne Gate, where a small gratuity loosened the night clerk's tongue considerably. The message had indeed been dispatched the previous afternoon by a gentleman of foreign accent and middle height, distinguished by an ornate watch chain that caught the gaslight as he drummed it impatiently against the counter while awaiting confirmation of transmission. Swiss, most likely, the clerk volunteered, his memory sharpened by the unusual circumstances. Carried himself like a craftsman, precise in his movements, though he seemed uncommonly nervous for such a simple transaction. The messenger depot on Story's Gate yielded even more substantial intelligence. The boy who had delivered the mysterious package to Sir Alistair remembered it distinctly for its peculiar aromatic qualities and the sender's insistence upon careful handling. "Smelt like glue and violin rosin," he reported with the observational skills of London's streetwise youth. "The foreign gentleman what sent it had a neat little case of tools, like what a surgeon might carry, and gave me an extra twopence to mind the box careful like." Holmes's questions came with surgical precision, extracting details that painted an increasingly clear picture of our mysterious clockmaker. The description matched too closely to be coincidental: the tidy beard, careful hands, and most significantly, a distinctive nick upon the left thumb that spoke of years working with precision instruments. "Golden Square," Holmes murmured, as our cab lurched into motion once more. "Several foreigners of mechanical trades maintain lodgings there, according to our young messenger. If Herr Zimmermann has remained in London, we shall find him within the hour." The fog in Golden Square possessed a different quality than that of Westminster, darker and more oppressive, as if the very air exhaled the coal dust and metallic residue of nearby workshops. A dim light burned behind the curtained window of a second-floor room in a modest lodging-house, where the keeper, roused by Lestrade's official card, led us up narrow stairs whose treads betrayed recent traffic in oil and metal filings. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing a cramped chamber that served as both living quarters and workshop. The cloak's sweetish scent that greeted us spoke immediately of tragedy, though the scene within suggested something far more complex than simple despair. Upon a cluttered workbench lay an array of precision instruments, tiny files, brass wheels, and coils of silk thread identical to those we had discovered at the crime scene. The man himself lay crumpled beside his bench, his neat beard and careful hands confirming his identity as our elusive clockmaker. The bitter almond scent that clung to his still form left little doubt regarding the cause of death, though my medical examination revealed curious inconsistencies with simple suicide. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary inspection. "The absence of any vessel that might have contained the poison, the precise positioning of the body, and most significantly, these traces of coal oil upon the door, handle-bearing grit such as one finds at industrial works." Among the scattered tools and materials, Holmes discovered a small muslin bag containing rosin, a cake of beeswax impressed with a toothed pattern that precisely matched the brass sliver from Sir Alistair's wastebasket, and most tellingly, a length of crimson silk thread frayed at one end. Each item represented another piece in the intricate puzzle our killer had constructed. "Zimmermann was silenced before he could reveal the mechanism," Holmes concluded, his voice carrying that note of grim satisfaction which marked significant understanding. "Our murderer possessed sufficient ruthlessness to eliminate his own accomplice once the primary crime was accomplished." The implications settled upon our group with uncomfortable weight as Holmes continued his methodical examination. The game had indeed entered a more dangerous phase, with a killer who would stop at nothing to protect his ingenious method from discovery. My medical examination of Zimmermann's corpse confirmed the presence of prussic acid by the unmistakable bitter almond scent, yet several particulars jarred against any simple verdict of suicide. There was no vessel or vial in the room that might have contained the poison. The lips bore no telltale chemical burns, and I detected faint abrasions at the angles of the jaw, such as might be produced by a restraining hand. The pupils were widely dilated, the fingers clenched in final agony, and most significantly, a minute thread of crimson silk adhered to his cuff where it had caught against the roughness of his workbench. Holmes moved through the cramped chamber with surgical precision, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail of the scene. Beneath the workbench, concealed behind a loose board, he discovered a leather-bound notebook filled with exquisite mechanical diagrams executed in the neat, continental hand we had come to recognize. The drawings revealed the internal workings of Sir Alistair's Swiss automaton with modifications that transformed an innocent curiosity into an instrument of murder. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, his finger tracing the intricate lines of the diagram, "how the automaton's original timing mechanism has been adapted to control not merely the dancing figure, but this secondary apparatus concealed within the brass housing. When wound and activated, it would operate with Swiss precision for exactly 2 hours before executing its deadly purpose." The implications were staggering in their elegant simplicity. A weighted silk thread, carefully waxed for silent operation, had been attached to the door bolt through that minute aperture Holmes had discovered in the ornate carving. The thread passed through a system of tiny pulleys concealed within the automaton's housing, controlled by a modified timing mechanism that could be calibrated to the very second. At the appointed hour, Holmes continued, his voice carrying that note of professional admiration reserved for particularly ingenious criminal methods, the automaton's clockwork would release the weighted thread. The tension would snap the bolt shut with absolute silence, the wax ensuring smooth operation. As the bolt closed, the increased tension would break the thread at a deliberately weakened point, allowing the door key, which had been suspended by the same silk line, to fall onto the carpet inside the room. Among Zimmermann's effects, Holmes discovered correspondence that painted an increasingly complex picture of the conspiracy. Letters written in a feminine hand spoke of past wrongs demanding redress, of promises broken and settlements never delivered. Most significantly, a Swiss marriage certificate revealed that Catherine Morehouse had indeed become Catherine Zimmermann, transforming the wronged mistress into the vengeful wife who had enlisted her clockmaker husband in an elaborate scheme of retribution. The landlady, roused by our inquiries, provided crucial intelligence regarding Zimmermann's final visitor. "A gentleman in city clothes called at 10:15, she reported, her nose wrinkling with distaste. Well-bred manner, but his boots carried black filth on them, like what you'd find at the great furnaces, left a smell of lamp oil and metallic dust behind him, stayed but 20 minutes and departed in considerable haste." Holmes examined the stair treads with his magnifying glass, discovering traces of blue-black grit ground into the wood grain and a narrow smear of coal oil on the banister that had collected metallic filings from a workman's hand. Most tellingly, he found a pasteboard envelope bearing the crest of the Deptford Iron and Precision Works, containing a night pass marked with the initial P in a bold, rapid hand. "The chronology becomes clear," Holmes observed, his grey eyes holding that familiar gleam of approaching revelation. "Our killer visited Zimmermann shortly before 10 o'clock, ostensibly to collect the final components of their mechanical conspiracy. Finding his accomplice grow nervous and potentially unreliable, he administered the same poison that had claimed Sir Alistair, then departed confident that his secret was secure. The bundle of bank drafts we discovered among the papers revealed another layer to the conspiracy. Substantial sums had been withdrawn from accounts bearing Edwin Penrith's signature, amounts that corresponded precisely to the missing funds from the Admiralty contracts. The young man's nervous energy and obvious anxiety suddenly assumed a more sinister significance, though the physical evidence pointed elsewhere. Edwin's embezzlement provided an additional motive for swift action, Holmes explained, carefully preserving the financial documents. The independent audit Sir Alistair had commissioned would have exposed the theft within days, yet observe the industrial grit, the coal oil, the mechanical expertise required for this crime. These point not to a desperate nephew, but to someone intimately familiar with heavy machinery and precision engineering. Holmes produced the brass sliver we had discovered in Sir Alistair's wastebasket, holding it up to catch the lamplight. This fragment represents part of the timing mechanism that controlled the door bolt. The man who constructed this device possessed not merely theoretical knowledge, but practical experience with industrial machinery. Mr. Peregrine Blount's background as a mechanical engineer, combined with his access to the Deptford works and his intimate knowledge of Sir Alistair's habits, makes him our most probable suspect. The fog had begun to lift slightly during our investigation, revealing the gas lamps of Golden Square as pale sentinels in the gloom. Holmes gathered the evidence with characteristic efficiency, his movements betraying the restless energy that always preceded the final confrontation with a criminal adversary. The method becomes clearer with each revelation, he continued, his voice carrying that note of quiet satisfaction which marked the resolution of a complex puzzle. Blount arranged for Zimmerman to modify the automaton during the clockmaker's supposed maintenance visit. The device was programmed to activate at a precise time, manipulating the door mechanism, while Blount established his alibi elsewhere. Sir Alistair's death appeared to occur in an impossible locked room, with no conceivable means of entry or escape. As our hansom lurched into motion toward the Thames and the industrial works beyond Deptford, Holmes leaned forward with that intensity of purpose I had witnessed countless times before the capture of dangerous criminals. The game draws toward its conclusion, Watson, though I suspect our mechanically gifted murderer believes himself safely beyond suspicion. He has underestimated both the persistence of scientific detection and the inexorable logic of evidence properly assembled. The fog continued to dissipate as we travelled south through London's darkened streets, revealing stars that had been hidden for hours behind the yellow murk. Somewhere ahead in the industrial wasteland of the Thames, a clever murderer awaited the consequences of his ingenious but ultimately flawed crime. The moment of final revelation was at hand, and I knew from long experience that Holmes would orchestrate the confrontation with theatrical precision worthy of the elaborate deception we had unravelled. The Deptford Iron and Precision Works emerged from the dissipating fog like some industrial leviathan, its towering smokestacks and vast brick edifices testament to the mechanical ingenuity that had built Britain's empire. Even at this late hour, furnaces glowed red behind grimy windows, and the rhythmic hammering of great engines echoed across the Thames with hypnotic persistence. The air grew thick with coal dust and metallic particles, while the acrid scent of lamp oil and heated metal confirmed our deductions regarding the killer's recent activities. Our hansom drew up before the main gates, where Holmes presented his credentials with that quiet authority which had opened countless doors during our investigations. The night watchman, clearly impressed by both Holmes's manner and Lestrade's official warrant, led us through a maze of workshops where industrial grit crunched beneath our feet, matching precisely the traces we had discovered at Zimmerman's lodgings. Mr. Blount maintains a private workshop in the precision engineering section, the watchman explained, his lantern casting dancing shadows across rows of lathes and grinding wheels. Often works late into the night, particularly when some delicate project requires his personal attention, has his own key and comes and goes as he pleases. The pattern shop we entered bore the unmistakable stamp of recent activity. Precision lathes sat in ordered ranks, their beds sprinkled with blue-black grit that spoke of careful manufacturing work. Upon a workbench lay the tools of our killer's trade, beeswax cakes impressed with toothed wheels, a pot of rosin, and spools of crimson silk identical to those we had discovered at Queen Anne Gate. Holmes lifted a brass shaving with his forceps and held it against the sliver from Sir Alistair's waste basket. The match was exact. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary inspection. How the lathe's tool rest bears traces of the same brass alloy, while the grinding wheel shows residue of the distinctive steel used in precision clockwork mechanisms. He moved to examine a wooden box partially concealed beneath the workbench. The complete arsenal of mechanical murder. Within the container lay an array of delicate instruments that painted a damning picture, silk thread wound upon tiny spools, additional cakes of beeswax bearing gearwheel impressions, and most significantly a small vial containing crystalline residue that my medical training immediately recognized as prussic acid. Leather-bound notebook contained detailed sketches of the modified automaton mechanism, complete with calculations for the precise timing required to manipulate the door bolt at the appointed hour. Holmes straightened, his expression carrying that grim satisfaction which marked the resolution of a complex puzzle. The chronology becomes perfectly clear. Blount arranged for Zimmerman to modify the automaton during the clockmaker's maintenance visit, providing technical specifications while maintaining plausible distance from the actual construction. The device was programmed to activate exactly 2 hours after winding, allowing Blount to establish his alibi elsewhere while the mechanism executed its deadly purpose. Among the scattered papers, Holmes discovered correspondence that revealed the conspiracy's full scope. Letters from Catherine Zimmerman detailed her years of bitter resentment following Sir Alistair's abandonment, her marriage to the Swiss clockmaker, and, most significantly, her discovery of Blount's embezzlement from the partnership accounts. Bank drafts bearing forged signatures confirmed that the missing £15,000 represented not Edwin's theft, but Blount's systematic looting of the Admiralty contracts. Catherine Zimmerman's knowledge of this embezzlement gave her the leverage to demand Blount's cooperation in her scheme of revenge, Holmes explained, carefully preserving the financial documents. Faced with exposure and ruin when Sir Alistair commissioned the independent audit, Blount found himself trapped between discovery and complicity in murder. Holmes moved to the telegraph apparatus in the corner of the workshop, his fingers working with practiced efficiency. "Now we must persuade our actor to perform," he murmured, composing a message with theatrical precision. "Clock runs fast, police suspicious, meet me at works at once, Z." His grey eyes sparkled with anticipation. If Mr. Blount is innocent, this message will not move him. If he is guilty, we shall have our answer upon these stairs within the hour. We extinguished the lamps and settled into the shadowed workshop to wait, the distant hammering of machinery marking time like some industrial heartbeat. Holmes positioned himself behind the workbench while Lestrade took cover near the door, our trap set with the precision Blount himself had employed in his mechanical conspiracy. The sound of rapid footsteps upon iron walkways announced our quarry's arrival. Blount entered with obvious caution, a dark lantern in one hand and what appeared to be a heavy hammer in the other. His movements carried the desperate urgency of a man who understood that discovery meant not merely imprisonment, but the gallows. He moved directly to the workbench, beginning to gather the incriminating materials with frantic haste. Holmes waited until Blount had collected the most damning evidence before stepping forward into the circle of lamplight. "Mr. Peregrine Blount," he announced with that quiet authority which had confronted countless criminals, "I believe you have something that belongs to the Crown. The game, as they say, is up." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The bag of evidence fell from nerveless fingers, scattering its contents across the workshop floor, while Blount's face assumed that expression of trapped desperation I had witnessed so often in the final moments of Holmes's investigations. "You cannot prove anything," Blount said, though his voice carried little conviction. "Zimmerman was a disturbed man who took his own life. Sir Alistair died in a locked room with no possible means of entry or escape." Holmes smiled that thin, predatory smile which invariably preceded his most devastating revelations. "On the contrary, Mr. Blount, we can prove everything. The mechanical evidence is overwhelming, the chronology is perfect, and your own actions tonight have provided the final confirmation of guilt. The locked room was indeed impossible for any ordinary criminal. But you, sir, are no ordinary criminal. You are an engineer." The fog had lifted entirely during our confrontation, revealing stars that seemed to shine with unusual clarity above the industrial landscape. Church bells chimed midnight in the distance, marking the end of a day that had begun with an impossible murder and would conclude with justice claiming its due from the mechanically gifted murderer who had believed his perfect crime beyond the reach of detection. Blount's composure shattered like crystal beneath the weight of Holmes's accusation, his engineer's mind recognizing the inexorable logic of evidence properly assembled. The hammer fell from nerveless fingers with a metallic clang that echoed through the workshop, while his shoulders sagged in defeat. Yet even as Lestrade moved forward with official authority, Blount's technical pride compelled him to understand how his mechanically perfect crime had been detected. "How?" he whispered, his voice carrying genuine bewilderment, mixed with professional curiosity. "Timing was flawless, the mechanism undetectable. Zimmerman assured me the automaton would appear entirely innocent after the thread broke away." Holmes gathered the scattered evidence with characteristic precision, each piece representing another link in the chain of proof that would see Blount to the dock. "Your mistake, Mr. Blount, lay not in the mechanical execution, which was indeed masterful, but in underestimating the persistence of scientific detection. The rosin upon the door key, the silk threads caught in the window latch, the brass filings in Sir Alister's waste-basket, each detail proclaimed mechanical manipulation to anyone trained in observation. The fight went out of Blount as swiftly as air from a punctured bellows, and he raised his hand with a gesture that spoke more of exhaustion than resistance. "Allow me to explain the complete method," he said, his voice carrying the weary resignation of a man whose ingenious crime had become his confession. "You are correct in your deductions, Mr. Holmes, though perhaps you have not grasped the full elegance of the mechanism." Holmes nodded with professional courtesy, recognizing in Blount's request the same intellectual pride that drove his own pursuit of criminal mysteries. "By all means, the complete solution will prove instructive." Blount moved to the workbench, his hands automatically arranging the scattered components with the precision of long habit. "Catherine Zimmerman approached me 6 months ago with knowledge of my financial irregularities and a proposal that would satisfy both her desire for revenge and my need for Sir Alister's permanent silence. The motive was twofold. My systematic embezzlement of £15,000 from the Admiralty contracts was on the verge of exposure, while her enduring bitterness demanded satisfaction for past wrongs. He lifted one of the brass wheels, examining its toothed surface with professional appreciation. "The Swiss automaton was modified by Zimmerman at my direction, its internal timing mechanism adapted to control a weighted silk thread carefully waxed with rosin and beeswax for silent operation. The thread passed through the minute aperture you discovered in the door's carved frame, controlling both the bolt mechanism and the suspended door key in precise balance." Holmes observed this explanation with that intense focus he reserved for particularly ingenious criminal methods. "And the activation sequence?" "Calibrated to activate exactly 2 hours after winding, allowing me to establish an unshakable alibi at my club while the device executed its purpose. When the automaton's timing mechanism released the weighted thread, the tension pulled the bolt closed with absolute silence, The increased strain then broke the thread at a deliberately weakened point, allowing the key to fall naturally onto the carpet inside the room. Blount's voice carried genuine pride in his mechanical achievement, even as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. "The poison was administered with equal cunning," Holmes continued, completing the explanation for our assembled group. Knowing Sir Alister's habit of pouring his own evening brandy, cyanide crystals, were affixed to the rim of his preferred glass, held in place by softened beeswax that would dissolve harmlessly as the brandy was poured, releasing death into the drink. Lestrade's patience had reached its limit. "Peregrine Blount, I arrest you for the willful murder of Sir Alister Penrith and Heinrich Zimmermann. You will be taken to Scotland Yard, where you will be charged according to law." As we emerged from the precision works into the grey dawn, the industrial landscape of Deptford stretched before us, the Thames flowing darkly beneath bridges that carried the lifeblood of empire. Holmes walked with that satisfied stride I recognized as marking the successful conclusion of a complex case, his grey eyes already distant with thoughts of future mysteries. The locked room that seemed to defy possibility had surrendered its mechanical secrets, I reflected, watching the great city wake to another day. Once again, no criminal method, however ingenious, could long withstand the patient application of logical deduction and careful observation. The game was indeed concluded, though the memory of Blount's mechanical genius would linger long after justice claimed its due from the man who had believed he could lock a door from the inside out. The grey dawn that followed Blount's capture brought with it the methodical machinery of British justice, though the outcome was never in doubt given the overwhelming weight of evidence Holmes had assembled. Blount's initial defiance crumbled entirely when confronted with the contents of his private workshop, the porter's testimony from Golden Square, and, most damning of all, the mechanical components that matched precisely the fragments we had discovered at Queen Anne Gate. By noon, he had provided a complete confession, his engineer's pride compelling him to explain every detail of his ingenious but ultimately flawed creation. The full scope of the conspiracy emerged during those final hours of investigation, revealing a web of human passion and mechanical precision that would have done justice to the most intricate clockwork device. Catherine Morehouse, transformed by marriage into Catherine Zimmermann, had nursed her resentment against Sir Alister for years following his abandonment of their liaison. When her husband's skills as a clockmaker intersected with Blount's engineering expertise and desperate need to conceal his systematic embezzlement of £15,000 from the Admiralty contracts, the elements of what appeared to be perfect murder had aligned with mechanical inevitability. Holmes, settling into his familiar armchair before our Baker Street fire that evening, laid out the complete sequence of events with that crystalline logic that transformed the most baffling mysteries into exercises in pure deduction. The method, Watson, was indeed worthy of admiration from a purely mechanical standpoint. The Swiss automaton, during Zimmermann's supposed maintenance visit, was fitted with a supplemental mechanism that, once wound, would operate for exactly 2 hours before executing its deadly purpose. He demonstrated with his hands the precise choreography of murder. A silk thread, carefully waxed with rosin and beeswax for silent operation, passed from the automaton's housing through that minute aperture drilled in the door's ornate carving. The thread controlled both the bolt mechanism and suspended the door key in perfect balance. At the appointed second, the timing device released the weighted line, the bolt slid home with absolute silence, the chain drew tight, and the thread snapped at its deliberately weakened point, allowing the key to fall naturally onto the carpet within the locked room. The poison had been administered with equal cunning, cyanide crystals affixed to the rim of Sir Alistair's preferred brandy glass with softened beeswax that dissolved harmlessly as the cognac was poured, releasing death into his final drink while leaving the decanter itself entirely clean. The whirring sound Rook had described was simply the modified clockwork mechanism running down after completing its murderous function. Catherine Zimmerman's knowledge of Blount's embezzlement provided the leverage necessary to compel his cooperation in her scheme of revenge. Holmes continued, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight with that familiar gleam of intellectual satisfaction. When Sir Alistair commissioned the independent audit that would have exposed the theft within days, Blount found himself trapped between discovery and complicity in murder. The choice, from his perspective, was inevitable. The aftermath brought justice to some and redemption to others. Edwin Penrith's exoneration came through careful analysis of the forged bank drafts, revealing Blount's skilled hand rather than the young man's genuine signature. The missing funds were recovered from various accounts where Blount had secreted his stolen money, restoring the partnership's finances, though not its reputation. Miss Ada Vale, her professional discretion, having served her well throughout the investigation's most delicate revelations, secured employment with another industrial concern where her methodical efficiency would be properly valued. Colonel Ashford undertook the necessary legal measures to preserve Sir Alistair's estate, while ensuring that Edwin, chastened by his narrow escape from suspicion, would prove a more worthy inheritor than his uncle had feared. The household at Queen Anne Gate, under Miss Vale's temporary supervision, was set to rights, and the auditors Sir Alistair had summoned completed their work, revealing the full extent of Blount's systematic theft. As for Zimmerman himself, the investigation revealed him to have been as much victim as accomplice. His mechanical genius had been perverted to serve his wife's thirst for vengeance, and when his nervousness threatened to expose the conspiracy, Blount had silenced him with the same poison that had claimed Sir Alistair, staging the scene to suggest suicide while destroying the evidence of their collaboration. Holmes spent several winter evenings examining the modified automaton with the fascination of a scholar presented with a previously unknown manuscript. Stripped of its deadly modifications, the Swiss mechanism resumed its innocent function as a dancing master, though Holmes retained several of the precision components as additions to his collection of criminal curiosities, each representing another triumph of logical deduction over criminal ingenuity. The locked room mystery has always held particular fascination for the criminal mind, Watson.
Holmes reflected on a particularly foggy evening in late January as we sat before our familiar fire. It represents the ultimate challenge to conventional detection, the impossible crime that seems to defy the very laws of physics. Yet no mechanism, however ingenious, can long withstand the patient application of scientific method. He reached for his pipe with that gesture, indicating either supreme satisfaction or preparation for extended contemplation. Blount's mistake lay not in his mechanical execution, which was indeed masterful, but in his failure to appreciate that every action leaves its trace, every device its signature. The rosin upon the key, the silk threads caught in the window latch, the brass filings in the wastebasket, each represented an indelible record of criminal intent that no amount of clever engineering could erase. The case had demonstrated once again the fundamental principle that governed all of Holmes's investigations. The truth, however cunningly concealed, must eventually yield to the relentless pressure of logical analysis. The door that had been locked from the inside out had surrendered its mechanical secrets to scientific detection, proving that impossibility was merely ingenuity viewed from the wrong angle. As the fog pressed against our windows and the familiar sounds of London settled into evening quietude, Holmes took up his violin, drawing the bow across the strings with that same precision Blount had brought to his murderous mechanism. The haunting melody that filled our chambers spoke of mysteries solved and justice served, of human passions channeled through mechanical devices, and of the eternal game between criminal cunning and detective genius. "The smallest grit will tell its tale, Watson," Holmes murmured between passages, his eyes distant with thoughts of future puzzles. "A smear of rosin, a fibre of silk, a whir in the darkness. Such trifles are the chinks through which truth enters. Let us be grateful that truth, unlike clocks, needs no winding." The music continued long into the night, a fitting coda to the case of the door that locked from the inside out, while somewhere, in the vast metropolis beyond our comfortable chambers, new mysteries awaited the attention of the world's first consulting detective. The game, as Holmes would say, was eternally afoot.